everyone, and welcome back to the Towards Data Science Podcast. Now, it's no secret that the US and China are geopolitical rivals, and it's also no secret that that rivalry extends into AI, a domain that both countries consider to be extremely strategically critical. But in a context where potentially transformative AI capabilities are being unlocked every few weeks, many of which lend themselves to military applications with hugely destabilizing potential, you might hope that the US and China would have robust agreements in place to deal with the possibility of, runaway escalation of conflict triggered by an AI-powered weapon that misfires. Even at the height of the Cold War, the US and Russia had robust lines of communication in place to de-escalate potentially nuclear conflicts. So surely the US and China have something at least as good in place now, right? Well, they don't, and to understand the reason why and what we should do about it, I'll be speaking to Ryan Fedasiuk, a research analyst at Georgetown University's Center for Security and Emerging Technology, and an adjunct fellow at the Center for a New American Security, who recently wrote a fascinating article for Foreign Policy magazine where he outlines the challenges and the importance of US-China collaboration on AI safety. Ryan joins me to talk about the US and China's shared interest in building safe AI, how each side views the other, what realistic China AI policy looks like, and the obstacles that stand in the way on this episode of the Towards Data Science Podcast. Hey everyone, Future Jeremy here. Just wanted to drop in with a quick disclaimer that Ryan recently joined the US Department of State, where he's working on China-related issues, and he wanted us to make it absolutely clear that the views that he's expressing on this podcast, they don't necessarily reflect those of the State Department. In fact, we recorded this episode several weeks before he started his role there, so there really is quite a clean separation, but I thought it would still be worth flagging for clarity. Okay, on with the episode. Well, I'm really happy to have you here. I knew I had to have you here, actually. The moment I read your fascinating Foreign Policy magazine article, you cover a lot of ground there, and a lot of the focus of your work and of your thinking here has been around this idea of the US and China and their shared interests in things like AI safety. I think for people who are regular listeners of the show, they know a lot about AI-related risk. We've talked about that a fair bit on the podcast. I'm curious, though, first off, what brings you to China as a core point of focus? What makes China a really important focal point for foreign policy with respect to AI specifically?
Sure. Well, I think there are a number of reasons. Number one is that China's just been a huge focus of concern in Washington in recent years. The number of times that it's mentioned in, for example, Department of Defense documents has skyrocketed. It's the first and foremost peer competitor listed in the Director of National Intelligence's annual threat assessment. There is a lot of concern, at least in this town, about China, and I think that also reflects some reality. Where when I first started at CSET at the Center for Security and Emerging Technology, I came in with a lot of Russian knowledge and Russian language ability, and expecting to do a lot of work on AI in Russia. And that's not to say that there's not a lot of there. My colleague Sam Bendet has written quite a bit about it, but just the fact of the matter is that the scale of spending is astronomically higher in China. AI is seen as a lodestar by many in the Chinese military as a way of leapfrogging capabilities of the United States. And there just seems to be a lot more concern and progress in the technology being driven by private Chinese enterprises.
Okay, and what do you think accounts for that difference between China and Russia? Is it just size? Is it just the fact they have more resources to throw at this problem, or is there something else?
I think that's frankly a big driver. Yes, there's just a much larger market, many more enterprises involved, a lot higher scale of investment. The Russian government's also been very interested in AI. It's put out a lot of strategy documents. It's mobilized some funding behind it, but just nowhere near to the scale, at least that I've been able to see going on in China.
Okay, and I think a last bit of framing before we dive into the meat and potatoes here is going to be to understand, how does China think about AI? Because I think there's a lot of fog of war going on here where people just aren't clear. There might be some confusion as well at the Chinese end, I guess, but what if you had to summarize the kind of Chinese, this is a big thing to summarize, but the Chinese strategy on AI, they're thinking about it, what would that summary be?
It's a good question. I would break it down into a few parts. So I think at the technical level about what AI is and how it works, there's it becomes a lot more clear and a lot more similar to the way that AI is developed in the United States, right? You're still talking about machine learning models that are driven by access to compute, fed by certain quantities of data, and have their parameters refined in some way, algorithmically, in a way that conveys some novel capability that is presumably better than what humans are capable of achieving. I think almost everybody agrees on that. Where you start getting into differences and diverges is the level of attention paid to AI and the intended use cases of different kinds of AI systems. And this is where I think AI is a particularly important technology for the Chinese government and for the Chinese military. It's listed as the number one technology to focus on in China's 14th five-year plan. It's one of the top areas of investment, at least that I can see, that the Chinese military is making in terms of science and technology. There's just a huge share of capital being invested in the technology. The way it's discussed is with a lot of emphasis, including by very senior Chinese decision makers, including Xi Jinping. And so I think that's really where the focus on AI comes from.
And would you say that investment, that emphasis has been translating in actual capabilities? Because, I think a lot of people in the West, they look at our great labs, the DeepMinds, the OpenAIs, the Anthropics, those sorts of labs are making great strides in safety in part, but mostly in capabilities. What's your assessment of like the rivals or the equivalents in China? Like we have, I guess, the Beijing Academy of AI, we have Huawei, we have Inspur labs like that. Are they keeping pace? Are they leading? Like what's your sense of that?
This is this is a really important point. It's a point of contention, and so I want to be careful about what I say and what kind of claims I make, because frankly, it's hard to compare. It's
Mm.
really, really difficult to say who's ahead in a given technology. There are some significant differences, for example, between Huawei's like Pangu Alpha and models unveiled by OpenAI, although both really seem to be boasting some incredible capabilities. I think, though, in the military sphere, in terms of military operations, there are real capabilities that are coming to the fore that I'm seeing evidence of being purchased by the Chinese military. And so
Mm.
that is why I focus on this subject. It's what gives me pause, and I feel very comfortable saying that. It's hard, of course, to compare them to what might be developed by contractors in the United States. But just looking at the sheer volume of contracts being awarded by Chinese military units for capabilities that appear intelligent or that are directly related to artificial intelligence, it seems like there's a lot of money being invested, and it does seem like there are a lot of institutions involved boasting real capabilities, not just vaporware.
And so, what are some of those capabilities that you find most concerning when you see them in China?
Sure. So, for context, my team at CSET put out this study in October of last year looking at AI in the Chinese military, where we literally pulled down a bunch of contracts that had been awarded by Chinese military units. And some of the examples of systems we saw being purchased were this real-time combat intelligence guidance system that was advertised by a PLA contractor. It's a People's Liberation Army contractor called Data Exa. And it was advertising the ability to map in real time US ships off of the southwestern coast of California, US Arleigh Burke class destroyers, trying to track the speed at which they're traveling, the orientation, feeding all of this information into basically a single common operational picture that could then be given to PLA Navy units. And it's this kind of capability, this very high fidelity, much improved intelligence, surveillance, and reconnaissance capability that the Chinese military hopes will give it some leg up over the United States, or at least that will help it compensate for some of its longstanding deficiencies relative to the United States. Let me give you one more example, and that's in undersea warfare. There were a lot of systems that we saw being purchased by the Chinese Navy and by the Strategic Support Force. That's the element of the PLA that focuses on electronic warfare, among other things, for undersea vehicles that were capable of, or at least advertised as being able to detect objects underwater, perhaps to patrol for US submarines. And you can imagine these kinds of platforms being fielded en masse to try to understand the undersea landscape much better in a potential Taiwan contingency. So those are just two examples of some of the things we saw being purchased, which give me trepidation.
Right, and that is obviously framed and naturally framed in a competitive kind of language. We have the idea of the US developing technology, China developing technology, and kind of tracking each other's development and racing to build better and better, more capable AI systems and then fielding them faster. But your article also, in fact, it's mainly focused on this competition as being its own intrinsic source of risk. Can you speak to that a little bit?
Sure. Well, frankly, I'm very worried about the state of the US-China relationship, and particularly as it relates to artificial intelligence. I think that we could break it down into two elements, technical and political. So technically speaking, the United States and China are both interested in AI. They're both pouring a lot of money into this technology. The Department of Defense, of course, is making some huge investments in similar systems to those being pioneered in China, like autonomous vehicles, intelligence surveillance and reconnaissance, predictive maintenance and logistics, electronic warfare, et cetera. And the bottom line is that we're both trying to create the next best gadget faster than the other person. And at some level, that's understandable because neither the United States nor China want to fall behind in something that's so incredibly important and which appears to be a core locus of future conflict. But politically, the situation is quite dire and is going to create, I think, some incentives for potentially cascading effects and problems, right? The vast majority of Americans today consider China to be a competitor or an enemy. There haven't been very productive conversations between US and Chinese delegations when they've met, including senior leaders like Defense Secretary Lloyd Austin. It was only in April of this year that he was actually able to meet his counterpart in Beijing, Xu Ziliang, who is the senior vice chairman of China's Central Military Commission. Previously, he had been relegated to meeting with lower officials that were not actually his counterpart, like Defense Minister Wei Fenghe. This is getting into really in the weeds stuff about Chinese politics and the Chinese political system. But the bottom line is that the fundamental gulf in communication between the US and Chinese governments has meant that we haven't really been able to make headway on very basic issues like establishing channels for crisis communication, which we could rely on in the event of a technical failure of an AI system. And so there are these confounding effects between the technical and political that are increasing the level of risk in the relationship today.
And could I get you to kind of sketch out a very rough scenario of the sort that might cause this sort of risk to materialize? Like when we talk about this lack of communication, there's no big red phone, for example, as I recall your article saying, say, between the US president and Xi Jinping on issues related to AI risk or misaligned systems or things like that. Could you kind of sketch that out so we have a concrete thing to think about?
Sure. So let me say there are two things in particular that worry me, two futures that I think are avoidable, that are potentially caused by the introduction of artificial intelligence into military operations. The first is that there's some operator or technical error that precipitates a cascading politico-military crisis. And so you can imagine something very basic. Let's walk back to January of 2021 when the United States and Iran were in a period of instability. And I believe Iran shot down a US Reaper drone. There was some concern at the time that might provoke a US response. In a situation like that, it's very politically costly for whoever is in charge of the United States at the time to just fail to respond or to fail to respond with force that is deemed sufficiently appropriate by the American public. And so this creates a politically costly situation that might prompt some kind of escalation, some tit for tat response that continues to spiral into an unsustainable level of casualty or loss. So that's something that I'm worried about happening between the United States and China. You could imagine an autonomous system firing accidentally on some civilian airliner transiting the Strait of Taiwan. That's something that we want to avoid happening at all costs. The second scenario is that states might feel pressured to develop automated systems for more consequential decisions. And so, at some level, there's risk involved in any kind of machine learning system you introduce into a combat environment, right? It's making life and death decisions at some level. But at a very, very low level of conflict, that might be acceptable to some people, right? The former Deputy Secretary of Defense Bob Work, or Undersecretary of Defense Policy Bob Work, has talked about AI systems being used in combat and actually making better decisions than humans. And basically, he's advanced this notion that this is not just an acceptable level of risk, but actually there are some systems, particularly in target recognition and fire control, that could reduce civilian casualties, that it would actually be ethical to deploy those systems and even unethical not to deploy. But as you move into larger and larger levels of potential impact of miscalculation, then I think you start to enter a situation where an AI system should not be deployed. The largest being nuclear command and control. I think almost everybody can and should agree that a reinforcement learning system that is learning and adapting its own parameters of engagement in real time should not be able to fire a nuclear weapon. There's just too many, there are too many unknowns, there's too much that could go wrong, and the potential cost is too high to justify that level of decision. And so the gradient between helping identify a target at a very individual tactical level of combat to thermonuclear warfare is so huge. Deciding where to draw the line of what is an acceptable level of automation is a challenge in both the United States and in China.
It's really interesting to hear you kind of go over that spectrum of risk, because it does harken back to a lot of the conversations we've had on the podcast with folks from the AI safety and AI alignment communities, where they talk about making sure getting robust guarantees of the performance of AI systems, they won't fail in certain ways, and how effectively technically impossible that is currently. I mean, to your point, like, there really is no way to guarantee that an AI will not fail in profoundly counterintuitive ways. We can do all the testing and evaluation we want, we can have all the metrics we want, but ultimately those metrics are only as good as the imagination of the testing and evaluation team, and you can always find situations where an AI gets put in an environment that's just slightly subtly different from the one it was trained for and tested on, and that can lead to completely wonky outputs. So all the metrics in the world end up being as good as useless in those situations. But how do we get to a point where we're actually having these conversations constructively between two adversaries at this point? I think it's fair to say, the U.S. and China, or at least rivals. Like, how do you bring two parties at the table? And I mean, does China even have a willingness to do this? I've sort of heard a lot of mixed messaging on that.
This is the multi-billion-dollar question, Jeremy,
right?
And I'm glad you're asking it. And my honest answer is kind of pessimistic. Right. So I've been involved in conversations and trying to brainstorm some taxonomy of risk or some method of doing arms control for AI. I'm very empathetic to that mission. I used to work at the Arms Control Association and have been involved in some similar efforts for conventional and nuclear munitions. But when it comes to AI, it's so difficult to control. It's a digital technology. And my honest assessment is that neither China nor the United States are going to adopt some level of arms control or risk reduction that is not squarely within their existing interest. And so figuring out what those interests are ought to be the focus of people in the academic and the activist community, in the AI safety community, and not, honestly, in my opinion, on trying to, for example, ban lethal autonomous weapon systems.
Right.
That just doesn't seem like a politically tenable position. So let me give you some more context. I've had the chance to speak on maybe like a half dozen occasions with folks in China, some retired military leaders, some AI engineers, some people from the academic and legal community there during these kind of track 1.5 and track 2 dialogues. The bottom line is we've tried talking about banning or proscribing AI for specific applications, like a moratorium on introducing artificial intelligence to nuclear command and control systems. We've tried talking about coming to an agreement not to poison one another's data sets in ways that might unnecessarily risk loss of human life. We've tried talking about banning the use of automated weapon systems in certain geographic areas like the Taiwan Strait, or even in less sensitive areas around the Middle East for the United States and for China. None of these things have panned out. And that's because they are measures that require a huge amount of trust between the United States and China, which might require divulging some kind of information that could jeopardize state security in either country. And so political leaders in both of our countries are simply not going to go for it. That's just my read of the situation. And so the next best thing that I think we can do is at least the bare minimum, right? I say in this foreign policy article that you alluded to earlier, there are three things that we ought to be able to do to prevent these two kind of risky situations that I've outlined. The first is we ought to have clear statements on AI test and evaluation. Now, the United States has adopted, for example, AI ethical principles for its Department of Defense. It has a Directive 3009 on autonomy in weapon systems. I know you've talked about some of these issues before. Just last week, the Department of Defense released a 47-page responsible AI strategy talking about how exactly it's going to make sure that its AI systems are up to snuff and meet those principles and guidelines at a very technical level. Now, in China, I do want to be fair, there are ethical norms and standards that have been developed and promulgated for the development of artificial intelligence. And I think that's fantastic. In 2019, China released governance principles for what it calls a new generation of artificial intelligence. There are 8 of them. One of them is about safety and controllability. And it basically reads almost the same as what you would find in the United States. And again, in 2021, the Chinese government released ethical norms for a new generation of artificial intelligence, which are at a higher level. They're slightly more vague, but there are 4 of them, and they read very similar to the US DoD principles. The problem is political. It's the idea that we don't know if the Chinese military is actually bound by the principles being promulgated by the Chinese government for the development of AI in the private sector. I don't know the answer to that question. That's something I've asked people in China, and I've gotten kind of dodgy replies on, and I'd like more clarity. But it's not something that's been very forthcoming.
So certainly it seems like communication is just like, even at the bare bones level of understanding what frameworks apply to the Chinese policy ecosystem, it would be a big help to begin with.
It would be a huge help. And it's something that maybe it's just me, but I don't see and feel that in my conversations with Chinese counterparts. And it is really a source of frustration and opacity, I think, in US decision-making circles.
So you alluded, one of the themes that you highlighted that I think makes a lot of sense. You know, we talked about, I think we had somebody on maybe a few years ago now, talking about this idea of banning lethal autonomous weapons laws and international bans, that sort of thing. At the time, I thought this was a very compelling idea, but the more I've kind of done this sort of exploration, looked into how are the mechanics of this relationship unfolding, I very much sort of, what you're saying here rings true with all the little things that I've done. You know, it's not like I have any expertise here, but it definitely seems like, because we have a continuum problem here, there's like a spectrum of gradually escalating autonomy that you can climb up, and at every stage you can convince yourself, oh, it's just a little extra increment of autonomy, no problem here, and kind of convince yourself that it's okay to take that next step and that next step, because there's no clear moment where you go, okay, this now constitutes like automating a strategically important system. There's no clear precipice where we go, whoa, like this is the point we need to have that conversation. Is there, I guess I wonder if there's almost a way of manufacturing some kind of cliff like that, if that's even a fruitful possibility, or if you think that's a ridiculous notion.
I don't think it's ridiculous. I think the most politically tenable point at which we can draw that line is automated nuclear launch, right? Like there are just some things. I guess it's a situation where you know it when you see it, right? Where that sounds really bad, and we should avoid doing that. It just doesn't seem like automating that kind of decision is in the interest of any state, right? Because it would incur such massive cost and risk to the state that's deploying it. So that's one reason why, for example, Jack Shanahan, who was the director of the Joint AI Center in the Pentagon, in 2019, spoke publicly at a conference in the United States and said that there was really no situation where the United States would want to integrate AI with nuclear command and control systems. That was a statement which I thought was very momentous and significant. It's something that I've tried to goad other Chinese officials into adopting or saying, and they have not gone for it publicly, which I am concerned by, as it does seem like privately there's really no reason to adopt something like that. Now that's not to say. Let me pause really quickly and let me go back and say that Russia, for example, has technically on paper an automated nuclear launch system called the Dead Hand, and you could imagine a scenario where, given a certain set of parameters, no communication of the executive, blinding flashes of light, glass shattering all over the place, you assume a nuclear launch has gone off, and therefore you automate the decision to launch retaliatory nuclear weapons.
Right.
That's something that Russia currently has, but it's not based on machine learning. It's not based on artificial intelligence. It's not learning parameters in real time, which could, break or due to some unknown technical error. Now, my opinion is Russia,
they're also like clearly human understandable kind of constraints, right? I mean, it's not some black box opaque bunch of parameters that just predict something for no reason. Yeah.
That's right. That's right. And honestly, I don't think that Russia should have the system, right? If I were the Russian president, I would think this would be a little bit crazy. But in as much as Russia does, we have to acknowledge that reality, and just draw the line one step below, which is let's not introduce AI into the equation. And so I think that's a reasonable line. That's something that I'm glad that the United States has drawn. I think it's in the United States' interest to draw. I think it's in China's interest to draw, and I'm not sure why they haven't.
So yeah, I mean that is, it does seem like a very natural line to draw and a very potentially fruitful one to start with too, because once you have some trust built up on that issue, hopefully you can start to expand that sort of circle outwards. It also kind of has me wonder about other potential areas of collaboration, and not to sound too naive about this and the prospects, but when we talk about the reliability of AI systems, and this idea of AI safety, AI alignment, AI robustness, making sure that an AI doesn't just basically go haywire the minute you put it in a mildly new situation. It kind of seems like the US and China have a shared interest in making sure that the AI systems that they build and deploy are aligned, do have this property of robustness. And I mean, I wonder, so one question I might have is like, if you see any potential in kind of collaboration on that topic. I guess that would require us to be able to cleave off safety from capabilities research, which maybe is not such a trivial thing to do. But I think there are analogies for this, right? Like in the Cold War, the U.S. shared nuclear safety secrets with Russia, basically because both sides had this shared interest in not having the world go boom. Do you see any potential for an approach like that, or is that something based on the conversations you've been having with folks in China that just wouldn't be in the cards?
This is another great question, and I've heard of this analogy before of like the permissive action link, which is on nuclear weapons. It's a safeguard that we deliberately proliferated. We gave that technology to multiple states, including Pakistan at the time, even though the United States was opposed to its nuclear weapon tests, because it was in the interest to share it. But I'm just not aware of any kind of analog that is one size fits all, multi-purpose for AI systems. And I think talking about and actually carving out safety protocols, as I said before, it requires divulging just too much information about the capabilities themselves to be worth doing that. The next best thing that I think we should do, honestly, is unilateral statements about what our safety and testing processes even are, right? So I maybe I'm biased, but I just genuinely believe that the U.S. Department of Defense cares about AI safety and wants its systems to work as intended and not to kill civilians, right? That's something that many people in the United States do not actually believe is true for China. They either attribute it to malice of China's political leaders. I think a more compelling explanation, though, is that there are pressures in the Chinese political system that reward the speed of deploying new and advanced capabilities and succeeding in program management that maybe undervalue methods of safety. And so when I ask people in China, like, do you have anything like DoD Directive 3009? Will you ever develop or release it? That would just be nice to see. It doesn't even have to be aligned with that of the United States. This is not a substitute for regulating the development of AI in international fora, which is an argument that I sometimes hear. This is just something that should be in your interest and that is also in our interest, and we ought to be releasing these unilateral guidelines. And so the fact that it isn't clear if these principles apply to the PLA is concerning to me, and it's something that I've raised multiple times and kind of been brushed off.
And why do you think, I mean, this is an impossible question to answer a priori, but I'm just curious to kind of chew the fat on this. Like, why do you think that is specifically? It does seem like it would be in the PLA's interest to say, hey, these are our guidelines that engenders trust around the world. It reduces the likelihood of catastrophic escalation for all the reasons you described. Is it just that, like, it's a centrally planned economy and there's no metric specified for this? Nobody's getting promoted based on this kind of risk reduction, or is it something else?
My charitable view of this is that, if I'm sitting in Beijing and I'm seeing the United States release these responsible AI principles, right? My argument is that that's an effort to whitewash or undermine or suck the wind out of proposals at the UN group of government experts to seriously regulate the development of lethal autonomous weapons. And so I think, unilateral action, my talking point is unilateral action in any situation like this is bad and should be frowned upon. We need to work together. We need enforceable guidelines, and nothing short of that is acceptable. And so that's the argument that I think that's where I think Chinese counterparts are coming from.
And sorry, just to be clear that I'm understanding the rationale there. So the idea would be the U.S. is doing this unilaterally in the hopes of reducing interest at the level of the UN for forcing all nations to kind of abide by a universal set of standards. So the US can say, like, hey, we're already doing this, like, don't bother us with this. That's sort of the idea.
Right.
Okay.
That's how I believe Chinese counterparts are interpreting what the United States is doing. I don't think that's right at all. I think that the United States independently seriously treats AI like a technology that needs to be developed responsibly and cares whether its systems work or not. And so in the United States, like, conversely, the perspective is, why won't China do this? It's kind of concerning that the Chinese military just won't say, yeah, don't worry, we test our systems, here's how we do it. We make sure they meet some kind of guidelines in a way that is in any way analogous to anything the DoD is doing. If we had that, I think that would make me feel a lot better. I would sleep better at night. I think other people in Washington would too. I've asked for it before, though, and just kind of been met with some sniping. So,
and what do you think the U.S. could do to kind of counteract that perspective that the Chinese are there things that it could do? Could it put stuff forward in the UN voluntarily, or?
I think it's difficult because my honest assessment of international efforts to regulate AI is that they are really struggling. Without projecting my own views onto the situation, it doesn't seem like it's in the interest of the United States to bind itself in a straitjacket, right? There are too many memories of, like, the Intermediate Range Nuclear Forces Treaty with Russia and other situations where the United States has felt cheated. Like, it's basically sacrificed some capability that might have been actually very useful in a conflict and not been met with the same reciprocity from Russia or China. And likewise, from China's perspective, the Chinese delegation has put forward some proposals to ban lethal autonomous weapons, but they've defined them in ways, I think you've talked about this on the podcast before, but they've defined them in ways that are extremely narrow. They're only talking about systems that cannot be recalled once launched, and which create some disproportional impacts potentially on civilians. So the definitions they're using and the systems they're trying to ban basically wouldn't actually include almost anything the United States or China are developing. And so the view in Washington is that that's just disingenuous. And so basically, like, the view in Washington is that China is disingenuous about its efforts to ban laws at the UN. And China's view is that the United States has no interest in this and it's totally disingenuous in whatever it says. And so really there's just a total impasse. So I'm not that optimistic.
It's almost like it's exactly what you'd expect when two parties who are historical adversaries don't talk at all and don't have a channel of communication. I'd be fascinated to hear your insights, your perspective on what communication looks like between those two parties, because there are a lot of different ways, some formal, some less formal, that two different countries like this can communicate. What are some of the channels? You mentioned you talk to some old Chinese officials, folks who maybe are not still in the PLA or kind of faintly affiliated with it. So what are some of those channels? Are there any of those that seem particularly fruitful, or are they all kind of a wash at this point?
I think, maybe I'm naive, but I think that everybody learns something from communication. Every meeting that we have, no matter how low level, no matter how unofficial, provides some data point on like how people in China are actually thinking about the technology and actually trying to mitigate risk. And I think that's really valuable and should continue. And so I jumped at the opportunity to speak with folks in China, and I know a lot of other people in Washington feel the same. The problem there are really two issues. One problem is in translating kind of agreements and conversations at lower and less official levels, like those that I'm part of, up to real senior decision makers who are capable of doing something, right? So I've talked to folks in China who are like, yeah, automating nuclear launch is bad. We would never do that. But then the question is, well, what is lost? Like, why is General Wei Fenghe like unable or unwilling to make that statement in public?
Right.
Like, is it that the counterparts I'm talking to don't actually have their ear? Is it that they don't actually have any kind of influence in policymaking circles? I'm just trying to figure out what the disconnect is. I think that's also true of conversations with engineers who appreciate the risks of AI systems,
Right.
who know about the problem with like distribution shift, or with specification gaming or any other number of AI failure modes, but getting senior decision makers who are looking at like the number of battle force ships and trying to make budget decisions, trying to convince them of the problems with AI systems is not an easy task.
Yeah, it almost seems like there's a cultural, political difference there that really manifests at this level, where all the rhetoric, the Chinese end seems to be, veering on like imperialistic, certainly aggressive in its approach to the U.S. and the West, and then you've got in the U.S. much more attention to like human life and protecting kind of civilians, and also just generally having a higher bar for safety standards just historically. Maybe one of the consequences of being an emerging power is things just happen so fast you don't have the chance to really think about long-termism and robustness. I guess I wonder if there's like at the political level in the U.S., if there's a way of kind of fast-tracking that conversation. Like, is this something that you imagine the White House would benefit from tackling head-on in a louder and prouder way, so to speak, or is that not a channel that would be fruitful?
I think this is a challenging question. So let me start by saying I agree with the kind of cultural element that you've articulated just now. Personally, I try to be as charitable and as strategically empathic as possible, to try to meet Chinese interlocutors where they are, and whatever they say, fine. If that's the reason why they don't want to meet, I accept that. But I don't know what more the United States can be doing. I know that folks in the United States have on multiple occasions tried to establish track one conversations, military to military, government to government, with folks in China about AI risks. And it's not something that the Chinese side has been willing to go for. In fact, Greg Allen, who was the director of strategy at the JAIC, recently put out a piece for CSIS on this exact issue. There were multiple occasions where he tried to forge these connections and just was met with radio silence on the Chinese side. And so I don't know what more could be done. The only other alternative I can think of is more naming and shaming, as you say, from the White House. But I don't know how productive that would really be for the U.S.-China relationship at this point.
Yeah, I mean, so many almost personal, cultural complexities playing into this, and strategic ones too. And it does sometimes seem, I mean, I've had a lot of conversations with like Chinese researchers, not policy folks, but folks at the research level. And it does seem, while there is a general awareness that there's something AI safety related that's worth focusing on, when you talk to capabilities researchers, folks who are coming out with systems like CogView, for example, or Efficient Zero, which came out in 2021, you talk to these folks, and it kind of seems like they're aware of the buzzwords, but just not of the actual, like, they don't have that same vocabulary. You just mentioned, robustness and specification gaming and that sort of thing. It kind of seems like the awareness level, even among the research class, is more superficial too. And while it's better certainly than the strategic political class, that seems to be a gap to fill as well. I wonder if, first off, if you concur with that may not be something you've spent a lot of time looking into. But second, if that implies that education sort of across, like, is collaboration a good thing? Like, at what point is inter-Pacific collaboration, so to speak, a bad idea or a good idea in that context?
Ooh, yeah, you've touched on the real meat of the policy problem these days. But no, on the question of safety and how seriously Chinese researchers take it, I wish I could tell you more. I think you're in a better position to talk about this than I am. I just don't have the same links to the research community. But this is something that I've heard from colleagues who do focus on testing and evaluation and on AI safety. That there's concern that, to some degree, like in the United States and other countries, but really to a new level, there's this whitewashing going on, or this ethics washing of AI systems, latching on to words like responsible AI development without really putting in the due diligence required to make sure that they are robust and going to work as intended.
Yeah. Okay. Well, that's good to know. Now, in terms of the collaboration across, like, one policy question, I guess, would be: is it good? Is it good to have researchers at Berkeley collaborating with researchers at Tsinghua University with, like, open PLA affiliations? Say, maybe you could argue, I guess, that it's good for cross contamination in terms of exposing folks in China to more safety mindset stuff. But at the same time, if that helps with proliferation, if it helps with capabilities development, maybe not such a good thing. Not sure if you have a take on this, but I'd be really curious to hear one if you do have one.
This is the question, and I wish I could give you a more concrete answer, like ban collaboration, or like, no, open
Right.
collaboration is the only way. But it's totally situational, right? So 10 years ago, maybe it wouldn't have mattered as much. But now every kind of potential opportunity for collaboration, I think, is being viewed as transactional, and probably should be. In what is the value proposition from engaging with this institution in China, and what is the potential level of risk? And if you're working on natural language processing, maybe you say, yeah, that's fine. That's probably not the same level of risk as, for example, computer vision, in potentially contributing to ongoing genocide in Xinjiang, or in, like, military relevant capabilities that could be used to target the United States. Yeah, NLP might be used in some kind of intelligence processing system, and I've seen that used. I've seen the Chinese army buy those kinds of systems for that reason. But maybe you say the risk is low enough where it's worth it to collaborate on that topic. But I think there are certain subfields, computer vision especially, where I really question the value add and the utility, even if a Chinese institution is, quote unquote, ahead of wherever the United States might be, or wherever Harvard or Berkeley might be. I just don't know if it's worthwhile to actually get that kind of technology, knowing where it came from, knowing what it could contribute to. I think we're entering very dangerous territory in the relationship. Now, let me also add a caveat here. Not everybody shares this view. I know there are a lot of people in the United States who still cling to the idea, and I empathize with it too. The open international research environment is the lifeblood of not just the US-China relationship, but of global science and technology. And we should try to preserve it at all costs. I understand and appreciate that, and I argue that very frequently. But in the case of China, in the case of high-end research institutions, it is getting really, really hard to make that argument.
Yeah, I mean, it's funny. This certainly does resonate when you talk about the idea of siloed kind of research areas that maybe it's okay for NLP, maybe it's less okay for vision. I wonder what impact the trend towards highly scaled transformer models has today, because we're starting to see this sort of homogenization, this idea of like all AI really converging on a small set of highly scalable models. We're seeing, with DeepMind's Gato, great example of a single AI system that can do everything from language generation to images. And so this starts to kind of blur the line between disciplines. Computer vision is not necessarily separable anymore from language, and language is not necessarily separable from planning and game playing and so on. So I wonder if that kind of bodes ill for our ability to have any kind of international collaboration on this topic.
I fear you're right. I don't have anything else to say on that, but I fear that you're right, especially as we get better systems that are more multimodal in more efficient ways.
Okay, well, on that extremely uplifting note, actually, maybe that's a good question. If you had to give your most uplifting take on all this, what is the best case scenario? What are the steps that kind of could materialize to make this all turn out the way we hope it would?
Sure. No, I've been real doom and gloom this entire conversation, but I do want to say there are opportunities there are stones we haven't unturned yet, that now we're being forced to, maybe because they are the ones that we wanted to go to last. But let me just reiterate, I guess, one final kind of interesting question that I've been toying with, and it's the idea that, look, the United States wants to break China's military AI systems. I think that's a fair statement to make. I don't think that's very objectionable. I think the same is true in China. China's military wants to break the toys that the Department of Defense in the United States is developing. The question, the interesting problem, is that there are certain scenarios where we want to know exactly how a Chinese AI system is going to respond if we do X. If there is some kind of adversarial example used to try to cause that system to malfunction. The question is identifying under which circumstances we have an interest in making Chinese AI systems fail gracefully, and vice versa. And I don't know, I have not seen very good research on this, or it's more of a thought experiment than anything else right now. But trying to identify, when do we actually have an interest in making sure that one another's weapon systems or intelligence or targeting systems continue to function even under duress, and trying to build toward those capabilities. That's something that's just totally foreign, I think, to the conversation right now in both Washington and Beijing, but I think would be a real point of focus and could actually yield some kind of actionable result, because we're at the point now where nobody's going to act outside of their interest. There's no mutual trust, but identifying those nakedly self-interested positions is maybe our only chance.
Very interesting. Okay, well, with that note, thank you, Ryan, so much for what a fascinating conversation. I mean, I think there's so much here for people to dig into. People should be more aware of this as well, including researchers. You should be aware of what the impact of your research is, what it means to collaborate in 2022 with any other country. I mean, you should ask yourself those questions. We talk a lot about fair trade sourcing of our coffee. We talk a lot about where our t-shirts come from. Maybe it's time to have a similar conversation about artificial intelligence. Ryan, thank you so much for joining me for this. It's a lot of fun.
Jeremie, thanks. Same to you.